You have a banana in your kitchen right now. It is probably the cheapest thing you will eat all week. So here is the question nobody ever asks. How did something this ordinary end up at the center of a CIA coup, a massacre of thousands of workers, and a corporate crime conviction that just concluded in 2024? On June 27, 1954, the democratically elected president of Guatemala went on the radio to tell his country the truth. His name was Jacobo Arbenz. He told them that the United States was overthrowing his government, that American bombers were circling his capital, and that a banana company had ordered it done. Then the signal went dead. The CIA had jammed the broadcast. Arbenz finished his resignation speech to silence. To understand how a piece of fruit could bring down a democracy, we have to go back much further than 1954. We have to go back to a swamp in New Guinea, 7,000 years ago, where this story really begins. The banana sitting on your counter is the best-selling fruit in America. The average American eats about 27 pounds of them every year, which works out to roughly one banana every 3 days for your entire life. You have eaten them so many times that you have stopped seeing them. They sit on the counter until they go soft. They go into smoothies, they get sliced over cereal, and nobody in your house gives them a second thought. But here is what I need you to hold in the back of your mind for the next few minutes. The banana you are looking at right now is not the original banana. It is a replacement. The banana that your grandparents ate, the one that dominated every American market for the first half of the 20th century, no longer exists. It was wiped out completely. And the one that replaced it is now facing the exact same threat. This fruit has already died once and come back as something slightly different. It may be about to die again. Long before any of this, in the highland forests of Papua New Guinea, the banana existed as something you would not recognize. The wild ancestor of every banana on Earth today, a plant called Musa acuminata, produced fruit that was barely worth eating. You would peel it back and find flesh riddled with hard black seeds the size of small stones. The seeds were the whole point of the plant. The sweetness, what little there was, existed only to attract animals that would eat the fruit and carry the seeds somewhere new. The banana was not trying to feed you. It was trying to reproduce. Archaeological evidence from a site called Cook Swamp, deep in the western highlands of Papua New Guinea, tells us that people there began deliberately cultivating bananas at least 7,000 years ago, and possibly as long as 10,000 years ago. These early farmers noticed something remarkable happening among their plants. Occasionally, a banana would be born that produced fruit with fewer seeds, sweeter flesh, something closer to what we would recognize. They saved those plants. They propagated them. They passed cuttings from one generation to the next. Over centuries, through patient, deliberate selection, the seeds disappeared entirely. The fruit became soft and sweet and seedless, and in becoming seedless, the banana crossed a threshold that changed everything about its future. Because a seedless fruit cannot reproduce on its own, it had traded away its independence for the protection of human hands. Every banana that exists today is a cutting, an unbroken chain of clones, stretching back 7,000 years to those first farmers in New Guinea. The banana gave up the ability to survive on its own. In exchange, it got us. From New Guinea, the banana spread across Southeast Asia and into India over thousands of years, carried by traders, farmers, and sailors who understood its value immediately. It was easy to grow in any warm, wet climate. It produced fruit year-round without the seasonal grinding of grain crops. You did not need to cook it or process it or grind it or store it against winter. You pulled it off the tree and ate it. Arab traders brought it across the Indian Ocean to East Africa somewhere around the 7th century. Portuguese sailors carried it to West Africa and then across the Atlantic to the Americas in the early 16th century. By the time European colonists arrived in the New World, bananas were already growing in the Caribbean, having arrived before them. But the banana's great talent was not just its taste or its convenience. Its great talent was what it was willing to do to survive. It had made its bargain. It needed human beings to carry it, plant it, water it, protect it, and it was willing to become whatever human beings needed it to be in order to keep that arrangement going. In the Caribbean and Central America, that meant becoming the most profitable agricultural product in the Western Hemisphere. It meant becoming the reason entire countries were restructured, entire governments toppled, and entire populations put to work under conditions that would not have been legal anywhere in the United States. That transformation began with one man and one railroad. In 1871, a young American businessman named Minor Cooper Keith traveled to Costa Rica to help his uncle build a railroad. The project was a contract with the Costa Rican government, a line connecting the capital city of San Jose to the port of Limón on the Caribbean coast. The plan was to move coffee to the sea. It sounded straightforward enough. It was not. The jungle was merciless. Disease moved through the labor camps like water through a screen. Yellow fever, malaria. Workers died by the hundreds, then by the thousands. By the time the railroad was completed in 1890, somewhere around 5,000 men had died during construction, including Keith's uncle and two of his brothers. Keith recruited workers from everywhere he could find them. He brought men from Jamaica, from Italy, from China. When he ran out of volunteers, he imported prisoners from the jails of New Orleans. To feed his workforce as cheaply as possible, Keith planted banana trees on the land alongside the railroad. Bananas grew fast, produced fruit in abundance, required almost no processing, and cost nearly nothing. They were the cheapest calories he could provide. But as the first trains started running, Keith noticed something unexpected. The bananas he was growing for his workers were attracting attention in American cities. People in New Orleans and Boston had never seen them before. They were exotic, sweet, unlike anything locally grown, and they were selling. By the time the railroad was done, Keith was exporting more bananas than passengers were riding his trains. The railroad had become secondary. The banana was the business. In 1899, Keith merged his operation with the Boston Fruit Company, a rival banana importer run by a man named Andrew Preston. Together they formed the United Fruit Company, capitalized at just over $11 million. Within a few years, United Fruit controlled 80% of the banana import business in the United States. They owned land in Costa Rica, Honduras, Guatemala, Panama, Nicaragua, and Colombia. They owned the railroads that moved the fruit to the ports. They owned the telegraph lines that carried the orders. They owned the shipping lanes that carried the product north. They called it El Pulpo, the octopus. It was not a nickname the company chose for itself. It was what the people of Central America called United Fruit, because its tentacles reached into every corner of their lives. If you lived in a banana-producing country in the early 20th century, you probably lived on land owned by United Fruit, worked a job controlled by United Fruit, spent money in a store owned by United Fruit, sent messages through telephone lines owned by United Fruit, and rode trains that ran on tracks built by United Fruit. Your government almost certainly had business arrangements with United Fruit that were signed before you were born and would outlast you by decades. In Guatemala alone, United Fruit owned 42% of the entire country's land, not 42% of the farmland. 42% of Guatemala. They controlled the only railroad. They controlled the telegraph system. They controlled the main port. Guatemala's president did not run Guatemala. United Fruit did. And here is the part nobody tells you. The company kept most of that land idle on purpose. They did not plant bananas on all of it. They held it in reserve, unfarmed, unused, sitting empty for decades. Because keeping land off the market kept the banana supply controlled. It kept prices stable. It kept competitors out. The deliberate emptiness of millions of acres was itself a weapon. This was the world that the banana had built, not through sweetness or nutrition or convenience, but through scale, through monopoly, and through a willingness to use violence when scale and monopoly were not enough. In the late 1920s, the workers on United Fruit's banana plantations in the Magdalena region of Colombia had had enough. And here is where you need to understand something. The same system that put cheap bananas on your table is what put those workers in an impossible position. The conditions on the plantations were brutal in ways that are difficult to overstate. Workers were paid not in money, but in company scrip, paper chits that could only be spent at United Fruit Company stores, where prices were set by United Fruit and changed at United Fruit's discretion. There were no written contracts. Workers were classified not as employees, but as independent contractors, a legal fiction that allowed United Fruit to ignore Colombian labor law entirely. There was no compensation for injury. There was no health care worth the name. The workday had no fixed end. The work week had no fixed limit. In October 1928, delegates representing Colombia's banana workers gathered to draw up a list of demands. They were not revolutionary demands. They were asking for a 6-day work week, an 8-hour workday, payment in real currency, written contracts, basic sanitation in their housing, the right to be treated as human beings who were owed something for their labor. United Fruit refused to negotiate, not to meet them halfway, not to acknowledge the requests, refused entirely. On November 12, 1928, the workers walked off the job. The strike spread through the banana zone with a speed that surprised everyone, including the workers themselves. By the end of the first week, an estimated 25,000 people had joined. The plantations fell silent. The fruit sat rotting on the trees. United Fruit went directly to the Colombian government. They told them the strike was communist. They told them it was a threat to national security. The American embassy backed them up. There were quiet suggestions that American warships might be needed in the area if order was not restored. The Colombian government sent 700 soldiers to the Magdalena region under the command of General Carlos Cortés Vargas. On the morning of December 5, 1928, workers in the town of Ciénaga received word that the regional governor would address them in the main square. Many of them had just come from Sunday Mass. They gathered in the plaza with their wives and their children, carrying Colombian flags, expecting to hear news about the negotiation that they had been promised. On the rooftops of the buildings surrounding the square, soldiers had positioned machine guns at each of the 4 corners. General Vargas gave the crowd 5 minutes to disperse. 3 bugle calls. Then, the guns opened fire. The official military report claimed 47 dead. A dispatch sent by the American Embassy to the United States Secretary of State on December 29, 1928, reported that the United Fruit Company's own legal representative in Bogotá had told them the total number of strikers killed reached between 500 and 600. A second dispatch, sent January 16, 1929, reported that the same United Fruit representative had revised that number upward. More than 1,000, he said. The bodies were buried in mass graves or, according to survivors, loaded onto trains and dumped into the sea to disappear. A Colombian congressman named Jorge Eliezer Gaitán stood before the lower chamber of the National Congress shortly after and held up the skull of a child who had been killed in the square. He demanded to know what crime the workers of the banana zone had committed to deserve this. The government that had ordered the shooting was swept from power in the next election, and a young boy named Gabriel Garcia Marquez was born that same year in the banana zone, in a town called Aracataca, to a family whose world had been shaped entirely by United Fruit. He would grow up hearing stories about the massacre from his grandmother. Decades later, he would write those stories into a novel called 100 Years of Solitude, which would win him the Nobel Prize in Literature, and which remains one of the few places where the Banana Massacre is remembered at all outside of Colombia. That was 1928. United Fruit had learned something from it. They had learned that direct military force was messy, that it left bodies and witnesses and congressional investigations. The next time they needed a government removed, they would be more sophisticated about it. By 1950, Guatemala had something it had never had before, a real election. Jacobo Arbenz Guzman won the presidency of Guatemala that year on a platform of land reform, infrastructure investment, and something radical for the region: the idea that the Guatemalan government should serve the Guatemalan people. Arbenz was not a communist. He was a reform-minded military officer who had grown up watching United Fruit drain his country. His land reform program, Decree 900, was straightforward in its logic. Large landowners, including United Fruit, were required to put their unused land to productive use or surrender it to the government, which would redistribute it to landless farmers. Compensation would be paid based on the value the landowners had declared on their own tax assessments. United Fruit had been drastically undervaluing its land for tax purposes for decades. When Decree 900 required them to surrender unused land at the price they had declared, the company claimed the land was worth 16 times what they had told the tax authorities. They demanded $19 million in compensation for land they had been paying taxes on, as if it were worth barely over $1 million. When the Guatemalan government declined, United Fruit went to Washington. What followed was one of the most brazen conflicts of interest in American political history. The Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had spent years as a lawyer representing United Fruit before entering government. The director of the CIA, Allen Dulles, had served on United Fruit's board of directors. The American ambassador to the United Nations, Henry Cabot Lodge, was a stockholder in United Fruit. The man who handled United Fruit's lobbying in Washington, Ed Whitman, was married to President Eisenhower's personal secretary. United Fruit is the only corporation in American history known to have its own CIA cryptonym. The Eisenhower administration decided that Arbenz was a communist threat in America's backyard. The CIA launched Operation PBS Success, a clandestine radio station called the Voice of Liberation, operated by CIA agent Howard Hunt, broadcast fabricated reports of a massive rebel army, fake battlefield victories, and mass defections from the Guatemalan military. CIA pilots bombed Guatemala City. A small force of CIA-trained Guatemalan exiles, led by a right-wing colonel named Carlos Castillo Armas, crossed the border from Honduras. The invasion force was so small, it lost its first actual engagements. It did not need to win them. The psychological operation was what mattered. By the time Arbenz understood what was happening to him, the confusion and fear had paralyzed his government. On June 27, 1954, Jacobo Arbenz went on the radio to tell his country the truth. A banana company had called the United States government, and the United States government had answered. He began to speak. The CIA jammed the signal. Castillo Armas was installed as president within days. The land reforms were reversed. United Fruit got its land back. The trade unions were disbanded. The workers who had fought for them were hunted down. What followed was 36 years of civil war. Approximately 200,000 people were killed. Guatemala remains one of the poorest countries in the Western Hemisphere. Think about that for a second. A fruit company wanted its land back. The price of getting it back was 36 years and 200,000 lives. And there is one more thing you should know about that moment. A young Argentine doctor was living in Guatemala when the coup happened. He had tried to help organize resistance to the invasion. When Arbenz fell, he fled to Mexico, where he met a radical Cuban lawyer who was planning a revolution. The doctor's name was Ernesto Guevara. The lawyer was Fidel Castro. The banana coup in Guatemala was one of the events that made Che Guevara who he became. The decisions made in United Fruit's boardroom in 1954 reverberate through the entire second half of the 20th century in ways that cannot be fully untangled. If you have found what we have covered so far worth your time, consider subscribing. There is more history like this coming, and I would not want you to miss any of it. Now, here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody knows. While United Fruit was toppling governments, a different kind of crisis was building in the banana fields themselves. And this one, unlike a CIA operation, could not be stopped with money or political connections or a radio signal jammer. The banana that United Fruit was selling, the banana that your grandparents ate, the one that built this entire empire, was not the Cavendish. It was a different variety called the Gros Michel. Big Mike. And if you could taste one today, you would understand immediately why everyone who has tried one says the same thing. It was richer, creamier, sweeter, and longer lasting after harvest than anything you have eaten in your life. And this is where it gets strange. When you eat something banana flavored, a candy or a popsicle, and it tastes nothing like an actual banana, that is not because the food scientists got it wrong. It is because they got it exactly right. Those artificial banana flavors were formulated to taste like the Gros Michel. The candy manufacturers locked in that flavor in the 1950s and never updated it. The banana you eat and the banana your candy tastes like are two completely different fruits because the original one no longer exists. The Gros Michel was killed by a fungus called Fusarium oxysporum, which causes a disease called Panama disease. The fungus attacks the roots of the banana plant, cuts off its water supply, and the plant dies from the inside. There is no cure. There has never been a cure. The Gros Michel began dying in the 1950s. Within a decade, it was essentially gone from commercial production. The losses ran to an estimated $2.3 billion, which would be roughly $18 billion in today's money. The entire empire that United Fruit had built, the empire that had bought governments and killed workers and toppled democracies, was built on a single variety of a single fruit. And that fruit was wiped off the earth by a soil fungus. The industry switched to the Cavendish because it was resistant to that particular strain of the fungus. The Cavendish was smaller, blander, less durable, but it survived. And survival, in the banana business, was the only criterion that mattered. Which brings us to something you should know about the banana sitting in your kitchen right now. The Cavendish is a clone. Every single Cavendish banana in the world is genetically identical to every other one. Not similar, identical. When you buy bananas in California, in Florida, in Ohio, in New York, they are all cuttings from the same original plant. There is essentially no genetic diversity in the entire global Cavendish population. This is the same structural vulnerability that killed the Gros Michel. In the late 1980s, a new strain of the fungus was identified in Taiwan. Researchers called it Tropical Race 4, or TR4. Unlike the original strain, TR4 can infect and kill Cavendish plants. Since then, it has spread through Asia, the Middle East, and parts of Africa. The scientists who study it are not wondering if TR4 will reach the banana plantations of Latin America. They are wondering when. Every banana scientist who has looked at the data uses the same phrase, not if, but when. If TR4 reaches the Cavendish plantations of Ecuador, Colombia, Honduras, and Guatemala, the global banana supply collapses. And because the Cavendish is a sterile clone, you cannot breed resistance into it the way you would a normal crop. You cannot simply develop a new resistant variety and plant it. You have to find a completely different fruit and start over. What you would be eating after that is unknown, but it would not taste like what you are eating now. So the banana has already died once, in your grandparents' lifetime, and it may be about to die again. Now, before we get to where this leaves you today, there is one more chapter in this fruit's life that most people never hear about. Because the banana is not just an instrument of empire and a victim of fungal disease. It is also doing something specific inside your body right now, and it has been doing it for 7,000 years. A medium banana contains around 110 calories and a lineup of nutrients that work together in ways that are genuinely useful. The potassium in a banana, about 420 milligrams per fruit, helps regulate blood pressure and heart rhythm. That is why doctors and nutritionists put bananas on the short list of foods worth eating every day if you have concerns about cardiovascular health. The banana also contains tryptophan, an amino acid your body converts into serotonin, the neurotransmitter most closely associated with mood stability and a general sense of well-being. Vitamin B6 supports that process. Magnesium supports sleep and muscle relaxation. The resistant starch in a slightly underripe banana passes through your stomach slowly, feeding the beneficial bacteria in your gut rather than spiking your blood sugar. A ripe banana behaves more like a quick energy source, which is why athletes have reached for them before and after training for decades. If you have ever been sick and been told to eat the brat diet, that is bananas, rice, applesauce, and toast, the banana is there because its fiber and pectin help bind the digestive tract and replace the potassium lost through dehydration. It is one of the oldest home remedies in tropical medicine, used in some form across every culture where the banana grows. The trouble is that getting it there cost more than the $2 you paid for the bunch. In 2007, the company that United Fruit eventually became, now called Chiquita Brands International, pleaded guilty to a federal crime. Between 1997 and 2004, Chiquita had made payments totaling $1.7 million to a Colombian paramilitary organization called the AUC, which had been designated a terrorist organization by the United States government in 2001. The AUC was responsible for massacres, forced disappearances, torture, and the murder of labor organizers throughout the banana-growing regions of Colombia. Chiquita paid them anyway, for years. In June 2024, a federal jury in West Palm Beach, Florida, found Chiquita liable for the killings of 8 Colombian civilians whose families had sued the company. The jury awarded $38.3 million in damages. In July 2025, a Colombian court convicted 7 former Chiquita executives and sentenced them to more than 11 years in prison each. The United Fruit Company changed its name. The behavior did not change with it. From the swamp at Cook 7,000 years ago to a courtroom in Florida in 2024, the banana has been present at every step. It did not choose any of this. It simply grew where it was planted and produced what it was bred to produce. The violence was always ours. Here is what I take from all of this. The cheapness of the things on your table is never a natural fact. Cheap is an outcome. It is the result of decisions made by people with power about whose labor is worth paying for, whose land is worth taking, whose government is worth protecting, and whose death can be made to disappear. The banana is the most affordable fruit in your grocery store because, for more than 100 years, someone else was paying the rest of the price. The next time you pick one up, you are holding 7,000 years of human effort, 1 extinct variety, 1 ongoing fungal crisis, 2 massacres, 1 CIA coup, and a 2024 criminal conviction in the palm of your hand. That is a lot for something that costs about 20 cents. If this is the kind of history you want more of, there is a lot more coming on this channel. Subscribe so you do not miss it. And before you go, leave me a comment with this. If you could protect one food from extinction, what would it be? I am curious what people say, and I will read every one. Until next time,